Next, we're going to check on how inequality and stratification manifest themselves. Marker Harlambos said that situations arise when multiple deprivations prevent individuals from participating in important areas of social activities. Ruth Lister, in Poverty 2004, which is a book of hers, refers to exclusion from full involvement. In other words, they're sort of talking about exclusion in Ruth Lister's case and deprivations in Michael Harlambos' case. So they're saying inequality और stratification के रूप क्या हैं? एक रूप तो यह है कि deprivation है, दूसरा यह है कि exclusion है of certain social categories. On the other hand, practical form में how can inequality and stratification be seen? It can be seen in a sort of a voluntary fashion, or it can be seen due to structural reasons, which is actually the majority of cases are structural reasons. So, for example, voluntary isolation or voluntary exclusion can be, let's say, somebody becoming a rishi or a muni or a monk and leaving society to meditate in the forest. Or in Japan, they have this interesting phenomena called hikikomori, which are these men in their 20s who decide not to leave their houses. This is quite an interesting phenomena because they feel that the world, they are not incapable of facing the real world, and instead they sit in their homes all day and play computer games and almost never leave. And that's kind of facilitated in the West by the fact that you get groceries home delivered and you can shop online. So voluntary exclusion can be the Japanese hikikomori. Daniel Byrne says that social stratification can be seen as a subject-object perspective, as in it is exclusion is something that is done by some people upon others. Now remember one thing: the subject is always active and the object is always passive. In other words, the subject always acts upon the object to attain his own goals. So this is a relationship that Daniel Byrne said exclusion can manifest. Furthermore, we can see that extreme social seclusion can be due to material and labor exclusion. For example, in medieval Europe, until the Enlightenment and perhaps even until the 19th century, Jews were not allowed to own land and buildings. Hence they were forced to rely on money lending alone without actually getting into agriculture and any of those activities that were associated with it. And of course, social distance is another form of exclusion. This would be, for example, within the caste system, the avarans who were considered untouchables, they were not allocated a varna, hence were outside the caste fold, outside that conventional Dvija plus Shudra fold which existed within the caste system. This was a Bahishkrit or a pariah community. And if you read about Faksen when he comes to India during the Gupta era, and he talks about whenever Shudras or Avarans entered the city, they had to beat a drum with a stick, announcing that they are entering the city, and then the rest of society can keep a distance from them. Moreover, exclusion has a interesting effect on social capital. If you remember, Pierre Bourdieu told us that there are four forms of capital, and social capital is one of them. And just imagine if you're excluded from social life, that you're completely deprived of one form of capital, which is social capital. This can lead to extreme marginalization of many communities. And as a matter of fact, in multicultural communities where multiple inequalities may exist to start the differentiation process, as G.D. Berryman said, it all starts with the differences. They can lead to cases where they are overlapping systems of deprivation which affect certain communities more than others, and this can lead to a very extreme form of marginalization. According to Anthony Giddens, his point of view is that homelessness is actually the ultimate form of exclusion, because he says it automatically excludes an individual from various other social services. This is quite interesting, perhaps in the Western context, but it is obviously debatable whether it actually causes an individual to be deprived of other social services. Perhaps because even in India, all your welfare benefits will soon be linked to Aadhaar card, and Aadhaar is generally a photo ID with an address proof. So if you don't have an address, it's very likely that you could face the worst form of social exclusion. Giddens, to move ahead, has his own theory of stratification, which talks about classes. The possession of property makes the upper class dominant. The possession of skills and qualifications makes the intermediate class the bulk of the middle class. This would include, your lawyers and doctors, etc., and all kinds of professionals. Then the working or lower class have to rely purely upon their physical labor. Furthermore, how does this exclusion manifest itself? Well, it manifests itself in delinquent behavior, which is seen in isolated communities a little more. For example, the American New York City ghetto of Harlem. It's often called a ghetto, although it's just a neighborhood. It's a place where a lot of crime takes place because African Americans are stuck there, and it and that form of social exclusion from earning social, cultural, economic capital has led them towards delinquent behavior. In other words, high crime rates, high divorce rates, high school dropout rates, etc. Because, of course, sometimes castes also exhibit delinquent behavior because of extreme isolation. One example could be the criminal tribes, which were delineated by the British during the colonial era. Interestingly enough, another form of exclusion is carried out by caste panchayats and khaps. And this is an interesting form of social pressure in the sense that it has no legal standing, but it simply puts social and moral pressure on people to behave in a certain way. And you see, the human mind processes social anxiety exactly the way it processes physical anxiety. Because back when we were hunter gatherers, we used to live in bands of 30 or 40 people. And if somebody threw you out of the band, if you were unpopular in the band or the tribe, and you were just cast aside and left to fend for yourself, you would definitely die. So, physical anxiety, the anxiety of actual life and death, is closely related to social anxiety, so much so that we've seen in the human brain the amygdala and later the hippocampus. These two parts of the brain actually process social anxiety exactly the same as they process physical or life and death anxiety, existential anxiety. So far, we've had a look at the ways that stratification manifests itself. So in this bit, we've largely looked at exclusion. Now we'll have a look at deprivation. Deprivation is basically denial of resources, whether they are social, economic, cultural, etc. Here, once again, Peter Bourdieu, I would like to recap his fairly simple and rather pertinent way of classifying capital in terms of social, cultural, economic, and symbolic capital. So he says that stratification will lead to deprivation of these four forms of capital, and these forms of deprivation can be either absolute or relative. R.K. Merton actually looks at relative deprivation, and Marx anyways talks about deprivation all the time. So I mean that goes without saying that you could always count on the Marxian paradigm to either explain or to cause or to justify these kind of notions. Material deprivation in the European Union. I found this quite interesting and rather ridiculous that the European Union, their standards of deprivation are the absence of these items. For example, a telephone, a washing machine, the ability to go on a holiday, to eat meat, etc. I mean, by that standard, almost all of us sitting here in India are living in absolute deprivation. Me particularly, actually. I would be quite deprived. I haven't gone on a holiday for many years. And I destroyed my television set once India lost a match against Pakistan. So I just basically see things on my cell phone now. Anyways, let's go back to the main topic. So the basic concept of social stratification. Let's hark back to the era of the Enlightenment, which was in 18th century Europe. And one of the well-recognized thinkers was J.J. Rousseau, Jean-Jacques Rousseau. And Jean-Jacques Rousseau had a very simplistic and a very appealing idea of society. He basically said that man is at his core a pretty decent creature. He's innocent of nature, and society has a corrupting influence. So the more advanced civilization becomes, the more cruel and more corrupt human beings become. Here, have a look. The more civilized the society, the more evil man will be. Here, I'd like to take a slight deviation and speak about the concept of moral simplicity of the of humanity. Moral simplicity of humanity, and Jean-Jacques Rousseau can be best understood by looking at the exact opposite point of view, which is Thomas Hobbes. Hobbes says that civilization actually has a civilizing influence on mankind, and that in the primitive world, life was nasty, brutish, and short. So it's interesting to see the differences between Jean-Jacques Rousseau and Thomas Hobbes. Personally, I am a little more convinced by Hobbes' argument because we see great deal of warfare among primate societies. For example, there was a big war between the chimpanzees of the Congo. Two different tribes exist, and they killed many of each other's members through over a period of time. So primates are known to be quite violent. As a matter of fact, once in an American zoo, a chimpanzee was given a birthday cake, and on his birthday naturally by the trainers, and the rest of the chimpanzees got so jealous that they beat him to death. So uh, one can modern man, if he is cruel, and if primates are cruel, then why would simple man be any different? Why would Adi Manav be kind of some kind of saint? Why would primitive man be any different? So J.J. Rousseau says this rather simplistic thing that man is generally born free, but he roams around, but he lives his life in chains, and that in nature man is noble, and in civilization he is corrupt. While Hobbes says the exact opposite, that mankind is generally amoral, and his life without law and order would be nasty, brutish, and short. And you can see Jean-Jacques Rousseau might have won many hearts in his era, but people were not cognitively convinced. As a matter of fact, the Jacobin Club, which during the ending phases of the French Revolution executed thousands and thousands of its own citizens, they were big fans of Jean-Jacques Rousseau. So they could not perhaps see the hypocrisy in this point of view. Anyways, let's carry on to Ralph Dahrendorf. Now, he is an interesting character. He is a German British sociologist, and his contribution was based around the conundrum that he faced while studying Marxism and functionalism, also known as structural functionalism. Remember, most of the time, functionalism is structural functionalism. There are just a few, these terms are interchangeable, and there are just a few contexts in which structural functionalism is different from functionalism. As a matter of fact, it's only anthropology where the anthropological thinkers differentiate between structural functionalism and simply functionalism. So let's get back to this. So functionalism does not count for conflict in society, does not count for the tensions in society. That's what Dahrendorf thought. At the same time, the Marxian perspective was far too simplistic, and it did not explain how society stuck together. I mean, if society was fundamentally flawed and deeply exploitative, then that society would implode sooner or later. And this is what Dahrendorf tried to reconcile, and his theories we can study later are very, very interesting. Now let's come to the really interesting part. What Max Weber says about social stratification. Now, Weber goes away from the standard Marxian or the functionalist point of view on social stratification, and he says that stratification is multidimensional and it has many facets. You see, the Marxian perspective only said that ownership of property is the basis of everything. And the functionalists basically said that, well, whatever system exists, unless it is imploded, was functional, and they will sort of suffer from a lot of illegitimate teleologies. if they in their arguments, because they say, well, it exists, hence it must work on some level, and it works, hence it exists. So that's a teleology. Teleology is basically sort of circular reasoning, like that. It's also called tautology, Tautology. The tautology is also sort of circular arguments. The chicken exists because of the egg, and the egg exists because of the chicken, and you don't really come to any conclusion. You can just keep arguing and ruin your life in the process. So let's come back to Weber. So Weber basically says that let's forget about one-dimensional views of things, and let's just try to understand what are the stratifications based upon, and they're based upon unequal distribution of power, prestige, and property. And these are manifested in classes, status groups, and parties. Now, a class refers to people at the same economic level, whether they know that their interests are common or not. So, a class could be the middle class, for example. The salaried middle class throughout India belongs roughly to the same class. They are in the middle or upper middle or lower middle, but they're near about each other. And whether they know it or not, their interests are closely related, because their paymaster, for example, would be either the corporate sector or the government. So they have a common interest, whether they know it or not. Secondly, there is a status group, and their power is based upon prestige. Now, prestige is the propensity in a society to reward certain attributes or certain positions. For example, in India, a civil servant is accorded a great deal of prestige because he is considered to be of a influential position, and he also has some attributes. I mean, if you cleared the UPSC or any state civil services exam, you must be pretty intelligent anyways. So intelligence is a factor, and it's rewarded by society, and the society holds you confers upon you, society confers upon you great deal of prestige, and this gives you status. Finally, the third one is party. Party is based upon membership of political parties who happen to be or not happen to be in power. And parties can be of two types. There's parties of principle and parties of patronage. And parties of principle, for example, you could go to the extent of saying the communists are the Indian Marxists are parties of principle. They believe in a certain ideology, and they believe that everything should be intellectually sound, where by their own logic. Whether their logic is right or not depends upon whatever debate we can have here. And there's also parties of patronage. Now, parties of patronage, I think one could say the grand old party of India, which is the Congress, effectively after the English left became party of patronage, as in it rewarded its supporters with it rewarded its supporters with power or with prestige or with access to a middle class income. In other words, they could elevate people to a certain economic class. So let's use an interesting example to illustrate these three paradigms that Weber has enunciated here. Let's just say that you are a farmer in rural Punjab or Haryana, or let's say Uttar Pradesh. So you're conscious that you belong to a class, it is the agrarian class. The second thing is that within that class, there will be status groups. Status groups within that class will be based upon, let's say, how much land you have, what is your standard, what is your standard of living on a day-to-day basis, and finally, they will have parties which they will support. For example, the Bharatiya Kisan Union was a big entity in this agrarian state strata during a large chunk of India's history up until the late 90s. So within a agrarian category, you would have a agrarian class, status groups which were based upon, let's say, how much land you own or how much money you own of that class status, and the party which you belong to. It could be the Kisan Union or any other sort of rural agitational group. Now we have enunciated three things which talk about power, prestige, and property. Parties' main strength is power, status groups' main strength is prestige, and the class's main strength is property. Let's go around and define what each thing is. Now, prestige we've already understood is that the willingness of society to confer honor upon you. That is prestige. Property is, well, it's pretty self-explanatory. Any economic asset is property. But what is power? This is what Weber thought about throughout most of his career. He had a very long career, he wrote a lot, and he had a big mental breakdown for good 10 years in the middle. Yet he wrote so much that he became one of the biggest thinkers in turn of the century sociology. And even today, so much is owed to Weber, it's unbelievable. I mean, you're all trying to get into the bureaucracy, and the theory of bureaucracy is given by Max Weber himself. Yeah, so much so that Weber, once he was translated into English, became a big hit in the United States, where Talcott Parsons, he brought Weberianism into America through translations of Weber's work. So and Weber was often thinking about power, and he says, what is power? Well, power is the ability to impose your will on others, despite the resistance. Despite the resistance of other people, you can impose your power on them and make them do what you are telling them to do. That is power. It's a very simple thing. Then, well, what is authority? I mean, there's got to be a difference between power and authority, and the difference is very clear. There's power. You add something to power and it becomes authority, and that is legitimacy. The moment you're legitimized, that is the day your power turns into authority. Remember earlier we spoke about the estate system in Europe in the Middle Ages. Well, the nobles had physical power and violence at their command. How did they turn that into authority? That was done by allying with the clergy. And that is what was the basis of their power. So the alliance between nobility and the clergy conferred legitimacy to the naked violence of the nobility and made them authoritarian governments that had authority. And authority is a little easier to exercise than power, because in the minds of the person upon whom you are exercising it, you have some legitimacy. Perhaps in this case, your power is endorsed by the will of God, which the clergy tells you, yes, these people, these nobles, they deserve their power because God has chosen them. Similarly, during the early caste system, the Kshatriya class was given a great deal of legitimacy through the Brahmanical class. Whenever a Kshatriya king was crowned, the Brahmins would carry out elaborate ceremonies which were supposed to reflect the will of God and confer that God has chosen this particular Kshatriya king as the ruler. So much so in Europe in the Middle Ages, the Holy Roman Emperor during Middle Ages was crowned by the Pope, so that he has legitimacy. So that concludes a very rough overview of the dimensions of power, along with what we already explained was prestige, and of course property, which is effectively sort of the monetary value of everything you own. It's something that everybody understands quite instinctively. We deal with property all the time. I mean, your personal possessions, be they productive or not, are always property. So let's carry on. Now, one thing we like to mention is that throughout this, we've been looking at stratification as sort of a vertical entity. We'd like to also mention that stratification can also be horizontal. It can be an axis like this, as opposed to a vertical axis like this. And for example, you see there's some positions where differences arise, but those differences are not evaluated are not evaluated or ranked in a different sort of way. So for example, let's say that you are HR manager in a company and you do the same job and somebody else does the same job in the finance department of the company at the same pay scale. So there is a horizontal stratification. You're on the same vertical level, but there's just a functional stratification which is horizontal in both of your cases, and you're sort of not considered of a different class, etc. One interesting example of this could be the immigration of Punjabis abroad. I mean, the normal Punjabi who owns a little bit of land here in Punjab or let's say in Haryana, wherever he uh, wherever he is presently, he's probably driving a truck or doing some sort of agriculture related labor. The same person will go to Canada and also drive a truck or a combine harvester over there. So that's an example of horizontal differentiation and horizontal mobility displayed by this example. Now let's get down to Bougle. Bougle calls caste being atomized or isolated. And why does he say that? Why is caste atomized or isolated? Well, if we look at the core concepts of caste, we have hierarchy, number one, mutual repulsion, which is number two, repulsion between classes, and hereditary specialization. In other words, the occupational division of labor was watertight. It had to be done. So over time, what's happened is the caste hierarchy after Article 14 of the Indian Constitution has lost its credibility. Meanwhile, hereditary specialization after the economic modernization and liberalization that we lately seen has also lost its relevance. This thing is no longer relevant. And neither is the caste hierarchy. The only thing remaining is the mutual repulsion between castes. And that's why he says that castes are atomized and isolated and opposed, and they exercise this mutual repulsion through endogamy and commensal restrictions and even contact restrictions. So a commensal means basically ways of living. So commensal relationship is commensal relationship, for example, would be a nuclear family is a commensal relationship, for example, etc. Let's have a look at the interaction between hierarchy and class. We had an interesting Indian thinker called Dipankar Gupta, and he basically says that, well, in the Indian context, we only seem to talk about caste all the time. Everybody is rotating around caste. And if you read a paper, you will realize about 50, 60, 70% of it is caste. And he says, well, let's just not keep harping on caste. Let's look at the caste-class interaction. And he says that socially visible differentiation can be termed as social stratification. So whatever differentiation that you can see with the naked eye, which phenomena you can observe, will become stratification in the Indian context. And he says that, well, you see, we have vertical stratification and we have multi-dimensional vertical stratification. So let's just make Max Weber sit on the shoulders of Dipankar Gupta and say that there is a vertical differentiation of class, party, and status. And a person can be here in class, but he could be very high in the political spectrum, and he could be socially sort of at this level. So this is sort of higher and lower. But he says, well, there are also several horizontal stratas that exist. So what will happen is that not only vertical hierarchies exist, but also many horizontal ones, leading to a overlap. And that's why a composite index for stratification is necessary, because you could be here on the composite index, you could be here on the composite index, you could be anywhere within this multi-dimensional model. So he kind of takes Weber to a next level by making this not only multi-dimensional social stratification, multi-dimensional, but also turns social stratification into a grid-like structure, a composite hierarchical index. And with this ends the first 1/3 of Unit 5 of stratification. Look forward to seeing the second unit pretty soon.